Hey everybody, it's Party Elite with another episode of Total Breakdown. This one was submitted by Phlanx and is an ESL game where he leads the Empire in a battle against Bretonnia led by Adolf Stalin, Emperor of Canada. The Empire is led by a General of the Empire alongside a Jade Wizard, 2 units of Swordsmen ranked up to rank 2 and 1, 2 units of Halberdiers, Sigmar's Sons, 2 units of Great Swords, 2 units of Crossbowmen ranked up to rank 1, 2 units of Handgunners ranked up to rank 1, a unit of the Knights of the Blazing Sun, and a unit of Demigryph Knights with halberds. Meanwhile, Bretonnia is led by Luen Leoncoeur and brings a Damsel, a Paladin, 6 units of men-at-arms with polearms, 4 units of Peasant Bowmen, 2 units of Pegasus Knights ranked up to rank 1, and 2 Field Trebuchet. Alright, we're going to start our conversation with deployment as always, and we've got quite an interesting deployment here. The Empire ready, well, first of all, very heavily on the left here, but ready for anything to come in from the sides or, from the other flank as well. We've got these Halberdiers here, these 2 units of cavalry over here, so if anything comes in, tries to be too clever, they're able to intercept and hold them back as well. Meanwhile, the front is pretty standard. We've got Sigmar's Sons and the Swordsmen up front here, ready to take any standard sort of charges from enemy infantry, and then the Halberdiers off to the side here, of course, in case any cavalry tries to poke in from there. The Great Swords spread out a little bit, and that's a great call because they're able to respond to aggression however necessary. Wherever they would be most efficient, they're able to dive in and help those lines out. And meanwhile, probably the most interesting part is how the range units are laid out. They're kept spread apart because the inevitable Bretonnian Air Force, when it dives in, you want to keep your range units spread out because then, no matter who gets targeted, you're actually able to fire in from all the remaining units and still cause damage to those, Air Force units from Bretonnia. So great call there, keeping them spread out. Good move overall, very interesting deployment, and yeah, it's interesting to see this sort of layout very heavily on the left. Meanwhile, Bretonnia have a pretty interesting layout as well. They've almost got sort of 3 subsections to the army. They've got their left flank, their right flank, and their air force. On the left here, we've got the men-at-arms with polearms up front, with the archers right behind, and on the right, we've got the men-at-arms with polearms, archers right behind them. And of course, on one side, we've got the damsel, and on the other, we've got the paladin, both for support. Now, these guys are pushing forward right away, and they're going to try and create sort of a blockade over here. Interesting move, good call. You'll notice also, of course, the field trebuchet on either side of this little stream here, and that gives them full coverage over almost the entire map. So no matter where the Empire would deploy, they'd have coverage with minimal movement required. They'll be able to cause damage right away. And then back here, we've got Leoncoeur and the 2 units of Pegasus Knights. And that's a very, very good call in terms of placement, because from here, if anything clever comes in from the sides, these guys are able to intercept and respond. If they end up hitting the trebuchet, they're able to respond right away. Or, if necessary, they can provide support to the front, whether it's the peasant bowmen that need it for an attack from the rear, or the front lines themselves. So very interesting placement there. And on the topic of the trebuchets being able to open fire instantaneously, you'll notice that they've already started hitting Sigmar's Sons, and that's a great call. These guys are unbreakable, so you want to cause damage to them ASAP. You need to kill them all, so good call there. Now, you'll notice over here the Knights of the Blazing Sun, they push out basically right away. And these guys don't have any vision. They can't see there. No one from Bretonnia can see that area, so they very sneakily get right past there. I would actually suggest sending the Demigryph Knights with halberds as well, because then you have 2 units that can work well together. They sort of balance each other's capabilities out, because when the Knights of the Blazing Sun dive into whatever target they're going to pick, this Air Force is going to get activated, and it's going to dive in as well, and it'll make quick work. Now, interesting sort of target selection over here from both armies. Interesting in positive ways, I mean. Now, the crossbowmen are firing into the men-at-arms with polearms. Sort of a standard selection. You want to cause damage to the front lines before they're able to collide with yours, and of course, that's very helpful. Just, whittle down the enemy, make sure you have a better chance of defeating them. But the peasant bowmen are actually targeting the crossbowmen, and I think that's a great call, because that makes sure that these guys aren't able to fire as heavily, they aren't sticking around for as long, they might even just, rout from the range fire, so very good call there, focusing in on the crossbowmen doing a lot of damage. Now, the Knights of the Blazing Sun had an option here as they rode up the side here. They could have gone into these trebuchet, but of course the Air Force would respond right away. Instead, they decide to turn around, and I think this is a good call to go after these peasant bowmen. However, they're charging into this unit over here. With their angle of approach, it would have been much better if they actually charged into this unit over here, because then the bulk of the charge would hit somewhere in the middle here, and any sort of trailing knights would hit these guys as well. So it would do a lot of damage to both of these units. But instead, we focus in on these guys, and that's perfectly fine. Of course, it does a lot of damage, both physical and morale. So great move there, taking out those peasant bowmen, basically making them negligible for the rest of the battle. And then now the Demigryph Knights finally decide to push forward, and that is far too little, far too late, because because as I mentioned, that Air Force is diving right in and they're causing a lot of damage. Now you'll notice that the archers have changed their focus here. They're firing on the men-at-arms with polearms, the other unit now, and over here we've actually got Earthblood going on, and that's a great call right now because Sigmar Sun haven't lost too many actual physical units, so they're actually able to come close to full health almost. So good call, they're getting that Earthblood in nice and early, but you'll notice the Knights of the Blazing Sun have given up. They are gone. So the Demogryph Knights, far too late to arrive. Over here, you'll notice these peasant bowmen have also crept up from the safety of these of this line here, and they're opening fire on another unit of crossbowmen. Again, you can see the health and the morale drop immediately. They have to be pulled back. You'll notice these guys were pulled back just into some sense of safety. So great call there, taking care of this range fire, because obviously range fire is extremely effective. I've mentioned it countless times. Now over here, back to these Demogryph Knights here. The Pegasus Knights and Leon Coeur, they sort of fly around and fly past these Demogryph Knights, which is a very interesting call. And the Demogryph Knights themselves, obviously being a little cautious, you don't want to dive in and get caught out, but they would have been able to sort of sneak by. If they'd been reshaped, they'd be able to sneak by into these peasant bowmen, or even come around into this trebuchet, but instead, they decide to chase in after the Pegasus Knights and Leon Coeur. So very interesting call there, especially into these woods. I would advise strongly against that. They dive in there, and that's a lot of units able to focus in on them. Now, meanwhile, you'll notice that up front here, the Empire is pushing forward. It's decided it's too late, or rather, it's taking too long. We're going to engage. So the peasant bowmen here actually do an interesting thing. They've been firing on these crossbows for so long, but as these swordsmen go by, and I don't know if this was intentional, but this is great, as they go by and as their shields are no longer able to protect from arrow fire from the flank here, these guys are now firing in and causing a tremendous amount of damage by firing into them from the side. So great move there, making sure these guys take a lot more hurt than they would otherwise. So I think that's absolutely a wonderful little piece of micromanagement. But that happens, and meanwhile back here, I just want to point out, the Sword of Couronne does go down. That reduction in armor and the reduction in melee defense does a lot of work to these Demogryph Knights. So you'll notice almost right away these guys take a lot of damage. Obviously with no melee defense, they're taken care of, they're terrified, so they're on their way out right away. Now you'll see these engagements begin. That peasant bowman unit gets pulled back just in time, just before the engagement, and these men-at-arms with polearms are diving in to obviously prevent that aggression. Now off to the side here, just one thing I'd like to point out. These men-at-arms, or rather these halberdiers, sorry, good call positioning them over here, because they're over here. Any aggression that comes in from the side, they'll be able to hold off for the most part. It might get a little sneaky, it might be a little tough, but good call. However, I would suggest lining them up a little bit further ahead, because then when the engagements start, the enemy would actually be in this shallow water, and that causes some negative effects for infantry. So I would have just deployed them a little bit further ahead, kept them out of the water, and that would just help, tip the balance. Even though they're just trying to hold the line, that would help tip the balance. Now let's get back here to normal speed. You'll notice everyone's sort of diving in. The General of the Empire obviously trying to get some support going on here, diving in with full force. I would have suggested maybe trying to come in from the flank a little bit, and you'll notice almost right away these guys respond to the General of the Empire sort of arriving here for support. Meanwhile, these halberdiers, as I mentioned, they should have stayed up there, but instead they dive in there into the water for a little swim. Not a good call there, because now they're outnumbered and they're taking debuffs from being in that shallow water. Meanwhile, over here, the General of the Empire gets swarmed completely, takes a lot of damage, and ultimately decides that this party is not for him, gets terrified, and is on his way out. He is out of here. He's getting out. Meanwhile, the Demogryph Knights with halberds are actually stationed there, and they're not getting any action in. They should have been pulled in as soon as they were, over being terrified. They should have been brought right back in and helped against, these archers, jumped into these trebuchet, but unfortunately they're just left sitting there. Now, a little mistake here by the Bretonnia player. The men-at-arms with polearms, they've sort of swarmed in, and they've allowed themselves to clump up and get stuck in by these halberdiers. It would have been very easy if, of these 3 units of halberdiers, of these men-at-arms, if one had been pulled down and taken in here to take care of all of this sort of ranged fire that's coming in, because it's quite effective, that ranged fire. You'll notice these 2 peasant bowmen, the Empire took a page out of Bretonnia's book for a second. They were fired on by the crossbows, and they're both on their way out. So if one of these halberdiers, or men-at-arms, had been pulled down and brought in to take care of some of these ranged units, that would have been absolutely massive to this battle. And meanwhile, the second unit, could have actually been brought around to come in from the rear and spread that damage, bring that damage in from both sides, sandwich these halberdiers, and take care of them very quickly. Meanwhile, over here, you'll notice a couple of things go down. So first the Curse of the Midnight Wind was dropped, which is a great move because obviously that reduces melee attack and armor, so it basically negates almost all the damage that the Empire can do here, and it also increases how much damage they'll be taking. However, shortly after, Shield of Thorns was put down. Now, I'm guessing that was mainly for the missile resistance, but it's a bit of a wasted cast because that plus 22% weapon damage is wasted when melee attack is at 0, so it was the Curse of the Midnight Wind that went down first. So the Empire kind of made a mistake there by continuing to cast, or proceeding to cast Shield of Thorns. Could have waited just the handful of seconds that it takes for Curse of the Midnight Wind to sort of disappear. Now still we've got the Demigryph Knights with halberds just sitting there on a picnic, it looks like. Unfortunate because it would be very helpful for them to dive in right about now, and meanwhile Leon Kerr is sick and tired of all this ranged fire coming in, so he's actually going in and has decided he's going to take care of the situation here. You'll see takes absolutely no damage on the way in, is able to dive in, take out these crossbows, does a lot of damage of course, and meanwhile the Pegasus Knights themselves as well, diving into these handgunners, taking care of them, so great move there, again, diving in, making sure the range units are taken care of ASAP, and you'll notice these crossbowmen are pulled to the side there, trying to do what I was describing earlier, trying to get shots in from all sides, but both of them, unfortunately, are terrified, of course, with Leon Kerr right there. Now the Halberdiers do dive in to try and cause some damage, but he's able to dive into these handgunners and eventually take off once more. Meanwhile, over here, the General of the Empire, having retreated to about here, decides that, you know what, he'll go back into the fight. He dives into the Trebuchet, finally taking care of this unit of Trebuchet, and eventually, shortly after, we'll head for these ones as well. Meanwhile, these peasant bowmen are left idle in the woods here. They should have been brought right back in, opening fire onto these halberdiers or opening fire onto these handgunners, anything, but they're sitting there pretty for just a little bit too long. Meanwhile, these swordsmen as well, sort of joining these guys on that picnic in there. They should really be pushed right in to take care of this Trebuchet, but you'll notice General of the Empire is heading in to do just that. Leon Kerr and these Pegasus Knights, they dive into this melee situation here. Another Curse of the Midnight Wind goes down, which is absolutely precious right now. And of course, Leon Kerr trying to get that terror going, trying to get a little bit of fear and of course physical damage as well. So good use of Leon Kerr, but ultimately the Pegasus Knights and Leon Kerr respond to this aggression from the General of the Empire. So they're going in there trying to cause some damage again. And meanwhile, over here, the Peasant Bowmen finally brought into action. Both of these guys opening fire onto these halberdiers, trying to cause as much damage again, because really, if these halberdiers were to dive in now and engage the Bretonian infantry, it would be very quickly taken care of. Meanwhile, the peasant bowmen are actually stuck in an engagement. They should have been pulled back. This is a very dangerous situation for them, and very quickly you'll see they are dropping like flies, and ultimately this Bretonian infantry division, let's call it, has decided to give up, and they're on their way out. Meanwhile, over here, with the help of an Earthblood, the halberdiers were able to survive for just a little bit longer and hold these guys in place, and finally these halberdiers sort of get a bit of a surround going. They got a decent amount of work going on there. Meanwhile, Leon Kerr drops another Sword of Courant, making sure that he's able to very quickly take care of these units, trying to cause as much damage as possible, but you'll notice right now a lot of range fire falling in on Leon Kerr, dropping his morale and, more importantly perhaps, dropping his health. You'll see very quickly one more volley, and Leon Kerr falls. So massive, massive hit to morale for Bretonnia, and you'll see these guys are on their way out. We've got a couple shatters going on right now, and of course these halberdiers, the second unit of halberdiers now, are very easily crushed because they really don't cause much of an opposition at all, and Curse of the Midnight Wind goes down on this unit of crossbowmen. Now they're going to take that hex with them as they rush away. That curse should have waited until this engagement starts, and then it should have dropped right here, because now you'll see that these guys are not actually affected by the Curse of the Midnight Wind. It's only these crossbowmen and these handgunners, so they aren't, and it doesn't really affect them in any way. So that was a really poor cast, and it could have made a pretty big difference at the end here. Another thing that could have made a big difference is if, again, these halberdiers hadn't just swarmed into this single clump. One of them should have been pulled back to sort of occupy the General of the Empire, not give him the freedom of movement that he has right now. And another one of these halberdiers, or men-at-arms with polearms, should have been pulled back and taken into these ranged units, scared them off, because really, that ranged fire is going to do a lot right now. So you'll see, the General of the Empire sort of loops around, he takes his time, positions himself, gets into a charging distance, and charges right in, and meanwhile these ranged units are firing in as well, so with that rear charge and that ranged fire, a lot of morale damage and physical damage takes place, and these guys are ultimately giving up. They're not here to fight for this. This is not their cause. So these guys start to give up, and you'll notice the trebuchet as well. The morale is dropping there as well, and these peasant bowmen, they're starting to give up as well. So ultimately, that's the victory for the Empire, decimating or destroying the Bretonnian military. Great use of range units, great use of, sort of flanking tactics at the beginning. I feel like this battle has very interesting deployments, and it also shows how terrain can be used effectively to hide maneuvers. And we of course see the importance of target selection and the value of range units, and maybe most importantly, we see why you should micromanage some engagements. I mean, there were times when the Bretonnian men-at-arms were just not engaged in an optimal fashion, and better management may have changed the result quite handily. If those handgunners and crossbowmen had been taken out a lot earlier, the amount of morale damage they'd done would have been, well, non-existent. So it's okay to clump up if you're trying to hold a line, but if you're trying to push through, remember, even the simplest of moves, the hammer and the anvil, even if your hammer might be extremely slow. Now, as always, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more Total War content, and keep submitting your battle replays. As always, I think this is one of the best ways to learn, and it's always nice to see great battles from the community. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the battlefield.